This banknote is worth $100 trillion. When Zimbabwe printed it in 2008, it couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Today, collectors pay more for it than it ever purchased inside the country. Prices were doubling every 24 hours, not from war, not from natural disaster, but from a political decision to seize 4,000 farms. And the government that made that choice is now offering billions to undo it. $100 trillion, printed in crisp blue and pink, became Zimbabwe's answer to an unpayable debt. In late 2008, the Reserve Bank released the $100 trillion note, the largest denomination ever issued by any government. It was not a symbol of wealth, but of a system in free fall. By the time these notes left the presses, prices inside the country were doubling roughly every 24 hours. In November, independent economists calculated monthly inflation at nearly 79.6 billion %. The annualized estimate reached 89.7 sextillion %, so large that numbers lost their meaning on the street. A loaf of bread, if it could be found, cost more each morning than the day before. The $100 trillion note, despite its staggering face value, could barely buy a bus fare, often less than 30 US cents at the time of issue. Official statistics stopped appearing as the government abandoned any pretense of control. Yet, paradoxically, these same banknotes outlived the currency itself. Today, they fetch up to $60 each on collector markets, prized as artifacts of collapse. The real economy that once gave money its meaning had vanished, leaving behind only paper and memory. Before the collapse, Zimbabwe's fields and barns powered much of southern Africa. The country earned its reputation as the breadbasket of the continent, not by accident, but through a highly productive agricultural sector that reached deep into every corner of the economy. In the late 1990s, farming supported between 60 and 70% of all livelihoods. More than 2 out of every 3 Zimbabweans depended on agriculture for work or income. Fields of maize, tobacco, and wheat did not just feed families, they supplied about 60% of the raw materials that kept factories running, from food processing to textiles. Exports told the same story. Agriculture brought in around 40% of all foreign currency. Tobacco, the flagship cash crop, averaged annual exports of 127,000 tons throughout the 1990s, and by the year 2000, commercial farms delivered a record 237 million kilograms, one of the highest outputs in the world. White-owned commercial farms, although a small minority by number, supplied roughly 90% of all marketed maize in the late 1990s, anchoring food security not just for Zimbabwe, but for neighboring countries as well. This was an economic engine built on land, skills, and networks, an interconnected system where the loss of one part threatened the whole. The scale of what would be lost was measured not only in hectares, but in livelihoods, export earnings, and the stability of the currency itself. In 1930, a single law drew a sharp boundary across Zimbabwe's landscape. The Land Apportionment Act barred Black Africans from owning or leasing most of the country's fertile land, reserving the best soils and reliable rainfall for a small white settler population. Over the next 50 years, this legal order shaped every harvest and homestead. By the time of independence in 1980, about 6,000 white commercial farmers held roughly 15.5 million hectares, nearly 40% of all agricultural land. In contrast, around 700,000 black families were crowded into communal areas that made up less than half the country's farmland, often on poor, overworked soils. The system was never just about market forces. It was written into law, enforced by surveyors, and mapped onto every rural district. After independence, the new government tried to address this imbalance through a gradual process known as willing buyer, willing seller, where land changed hands only if white owners agreed to sell, often with British funding. But the pace was slow, and the underlying geography of exclusion remained. The roots of resentment stretched deep, and the promise of justice through land reform would soon collide with the realities of politics and power. In November 1997, the government delivered an unbudgeted payout to war veterans, $50,000 each, amounting to billions of Zimbabwe dollars created overnight. The currency crashed by 70% in a single day, and the Harare Stock Exchange lost nearly half its value. This was not just a fiscal shock, it was a warning that political survival now outweighed economic caution. Within 3 years, that logic would upend the entire rural order. In February 2000, voters rejected a constitutional referendum that would have expanded presidential powers and allowed the state to seize land without compensation. For Robert Mugabe and the ruling ZANU-PF party, the defeat was a crisis of legitimacy. The response was immediate. Police were instructed to stand down as groups of war veterans and party loyalists began occupying white-owned farms. What had started as a promise of redress for colonial injustice became a campaign of forced seizure. Roughly 4,000 white commercial farms were taken, often overnight. The process was chaotic and violent. David Stevens, a farmer in Mashonaland East, was abducted and killed in April 2000. Martin Olds, shot dead at his homestead near Bulawayo, had once been decorated for bravery by Mugabe himself. Alan Dunn was bludgeoned to death outside Harare weeks later. None of these murders led to credible investigations or prosecutions. Headlines chronicled the violence, but the deeper rupture was less visible. More than 350,000 black farm workers lost their homes and livelihoods. Entire communities scattered, some to urban slums, others across borders. The land changed hands, but the skills, networks, and capital that made it productive did not transfer with the title deeds. What followed was not orderly redistribution, but the collapse of a system that had once fed millions and anchored the country's currency. Land itself was never the whole equation. The country's agricultural engine depended on more than just hectares and rainfall. Capital, machinery, credit, export contracts, and generations of farming know-how held the system together. When ownership changed hands through forced seizure, almost none of these critical elements transferred with the deeds. Tractors stood idle as spare parts ran out. Irrigation pipes rusted in the fields. The web of relationships, banks extending credit, buyers guaranteeing contracts, skilled managers keeping the harvests moving, all unraveled at once. The numbers trace the collapse with brutal clarity. Tobacco output, once a source of pride and foreign currency, fell from about 228 million kilograms in 2000 to just 48 million by 2008. Foreign direct investment, already shrinking, plunged from $404 million in 1998 to barely $3.8 million in 2003. As the export sector withered, the country's ability to pay for imports vanished. Food aid needs surged, with between 2.9 and 5 million people requiring assistance in the worst years. Formal unemployment approached 94% as factories shuttered and skilled workers left the country. Capital flight accelerated, draining both money and confidence. With the loss of export earnings and fiscal discipline, the currency itself unraveled, leaving only the memory of what had once made the system work. In the end, land alone was not enough to sustain a nation's promise. After 2017, Zimbabwe's leadership set out to repair the damage left by years of economic freefall and broken promises. President Emerson Mnangagwa declared the country open for business, inviting foreign investors and former commercial farmers to return, not as owners, but as partners in new joint ventures. By 2024, more than 2,400 of these projects had been approved, pairing black landholders with private capital and technical expertise. The results appeared on the auction floors. In 2025, Zimbabwe's tobacco harvest reached a record 353 million kilograms, generating around $1.2 billion in export revenue. Yet beneath the headlines of recovery, the legal ground remained shady. The government pledged $3.5 billion in compensation, to 3,500 white farmers displaced during the land seizures. By 2025, only $3.1 million, less than 0.1%, had actually been paid. At the same time, a new law restricted land transfers to indigenous Zimbabweans, barring both foreigners and returning white farmers from holding title or using land as collateral. Banks hesitated to lend, wary that property rights could shift with the next political storm. Contracts could be signed, but not always enforced. This fragile arrangement allowed production to rebound, but it did not restore trust. Capital flowed in, but always with an eye on the exit. Farmers could grow record crops, yet still lacked the security to plan beyond the next season. Zimbabwe's fields were green again, but the foundation beneath them remained uncertain, a recovery that proved output can return before confidence ever does. Today, Zimbabwe's fields may grow again, but the scars of violence, dispossession, and broken contracts remain. Production returns without trust, leaving ownership, compensation, and the true meaning of justice unresolved. Economic recovery is possible. Rebuilding faith in institutions is much harder. The land remembers what politics tried to forget.